Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the 10th Mama Charitable Foundation Lecture Series in Buddhist Studies. The theme of series is Buddhism and Senses. We're very happy and honored to have invited Professor Donald Lopez from University of Michigan, together with 4 distinguished scholars to conduct this lecture series. Today, Professor Donald Lopez, the 10th Mama Charitable Foundation Visiting Professor in Buddhist Studies, HKU, and Alva E. Link, Distinguished University Professor of Buddhist and Tibetan Studies, University of Michigan, will deliver the 7th lecture of the series, and he will make a conclusion on the whole series. Before the lecture begins, I would like to invite Dr. J. Sumarna of the HKU Center of Buddhist Studies to welcome and introduce today's speaker. Dr. Sumarna, please.
Thank you, Ben. On behalf of the Center of Buddhist Studies, University of Hong Kong, let me first warmly welcome today's speaker and the audience who are joining via several online media to the 7th or the last lecture in the 10th Mama Charitable Foundation lecture series in Buddhist Studies, hosted by Mama Charitable Foundation and HKU Center of Buddhist Studies on the theme Buddhism and the Senses. So today's speaker is none other than the key person of this lecture series, Professor Donald S. Lopez, Jr., who is our 10th Mama Charitable Foundation visiting professor in Buddhist Studies. Professor Lopez need no introduction to our audience. So Donald Lopez is a name that all Buddhist studies students and scholars in all localities and continents know. Professor Lopez has written, edited, translated, authored, and co-authored over 50 books and over 100 journal articles covering a wide range of topics that have become in Buddhist studies must-read by all. For example, I started admiring him during my graduate studies many years back in a seminar class where we read his edited volume, Buddhist Hermeneutics. Professor Lopez is currently the Arthur E. Link Distinguished University Professor of Buddhist Studies, Buddhist and Tibetan Studies of the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, and Director for the Study of Buddhist Traditions, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. So Professor Lopez has his BA, MA, and PhD in Religious Studies from University of Virginia. And during his long distinguished career, he produced many world-renowned scholars like Professor Jonathan Seale and the speaker of our last lecture, Professor Reiko Onuma, who completed PhD under him. Professor Lopez is a specialist in late Indian Mahayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and Tibetan language, and has also published widely on religions of Asia. I do not plan to say more, except I wish to mention that Professor Lopez has been a visiting professor at Columbia, Berkeley, Yale, Harvard, and many other renowned universities around the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Donald Lopez to present his conclusion to the lecture series, Buddhism and the Senses. Professor, please.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Let me begin by saying what an honor it is to be selected as this year's Mama Charitable Foundation visiting professor in Buddhist Studies at the University of Hong Kong, especially on the auspicious occasion of the 10th anniversary of this distinguished visiting professorship. In celebration of this anniversary, the Buddhist Studies faculty at University of Hong Kong generously decided to host a series of 7 lectures. It's my pleasure to deliver the last of those 7 lectures, all on the topic of Buddhism and the Senses, a lecture series hosted by the Center of Buddhist Studies at the University of Hong Kong, all with the generous support of the Mama Charitable Foundation. Let me say something about how this lecture series came about. In 2017, the National Museum of Asian Art of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., opened a major exhibition of Buddhist art consisting entirely of pieces from its own Freer and Sackler galleries. Generously supported by the Robert H. and Ho Family Foundation, the exhibition was called Encountering the Buddha. Like many major exhibitions of art, it was decided that the show should produce a scholarly volume. These have traditionally been beautifully illustrated art books. However, with so much of the greatest Buddhist art, including the entire collection of the National Museum of Asian Art, now available to us with just a few clicks on our laptop, it was decided to do something different. The arts are things that we experience through our senses, the sense of sight for the visual arts, the sense of hearing for the musical arts, the senses of smell and taste for the culinary arts, and the sense of touch for the erotic arts. Buddhism is renowned for its disparagement and suspicion of sense experience, for its sense skepticism, as a philosopher would say. And yet, Buddhism has made major contributions to each of these arts: the visual, the musical, the culinary, and the erotic. Why not explore this dilemma? In July 2021, a group of 10 scholars of Buddhism met via Zoom with the National Museum of Asian Art staff for a 2-day workshop with 2 scholars presenting on each of the 5 senses. The essays that resulted from that workshop will be published by Wisdom Publications next year in 2024 in a book called, as you might expect, Buddhism and the Senses. This is the final lecture in this University of Hong Kong series. The first lecture given by me was an introduction to the topic. The second lecture on the sense of sight was given by Professor Robert de Kerali, the scholar of Indian Buddhist art at George Mason University. The third lecture on the sense of hearing was given by me. The fourth lecture on the sense of smell was given by Professor Lena Verchery of Victoria University in New Zealand, a scholar of Chinese Buddhism. The fifth lecture on the sense of taste was given by Professor James Robson of Harvard University, a scholar of Chinese and Japanese Buddhism. The sixth lecture on the sense of touch was given by Professor Reiko Onuma of Dartmouth College, a scholar of Indian Buddhism. This is the last of the 7 lectures on Buddhism and the senses. Thus, after an introductory lecture, we've had 5 lectures on the 5 senses: on sight, on hearing, on smell, on taste, and on touch. How should the series conclude? One could provide a summary of the previous lectures, or one could provide a discussion of each of the 5 senses, examining topics that the previous speakers mentioned, but did not have time to explore in depth, because the topic of the senses in Buddhism is indeed vast. For example, one might talk about the 5 senses of the Buddha himself, beginning with the sense of sight and his divine eye, for the sense of hearing the sound of his voice, the Buddha Vachana. For the sense of smell, one might talk at some length about the Gandhakuti, the perfume chamber, first used to name the Buddha's dwelling in Jetavana Monastery, but later becoming a standard space in the Indian monastery where a statue of the Buddha was installed. For the sense of taste, one might consider the famous story of when the Buddha and his monks had to eat horse barley and the various ways that that story is told. One could give an entire lecture just on the topic of vegetarianism, how some Buddhist traditions permit eating meat while others prohibit it, despite the fact that the Buddha himself ate meat. One might talk about the tantric accounts of the Buddha's enlightenment, where the sense of touch plays a crucial role. Or one could devote an entire lecture to the 5 senses in a single Buddhist text, such as the Lotus Sutra. How in its 11th chapter, when the vast 7-jeweled stupa of the Buddha Prabhuta emerges from the earth, quote, the fragrance of tamala leaves and sandalwood trees exuded from all sides of the stupa, covering the world. How in the 23rd chapter, prior to setting himself on fire, the Bodhisattva Sarvarupa Samdarshana, quote, for a full 1,200 years, inhaled the fragrance of sandalwood, olibanum, frankincense, clove, aloes wood, and glue trees, and drank fragrant oils of champaka flowers. He then anointed his body with scented ointment. How in the 21st chapter we read that the Buddha, quote, put out his wide and long tongue, which reached upward to the Brahma world. He emitted innumerable and immeasurable colored rays of light from all his pores and universally illuminated the world of the 10 directions. All the Buddhas sitting on the lion seats under the jeweled trees also put out their long and wide tongues and emitted immeasurable lights in the same way. Shakyamuni Buddha and the other Buddhas under the jeweled trees manifested transcendent powers while fully hundreds of thousands of years passed. After this, they drew back their tongues, coughed, and snapped their fingers together in unison. Those 2 sounds penetrated throughout the Buddha world of the 10 directions, and the earth quaked in 6 ways. Each of these would be fascinating to explore. However, it seemed that instead of simply quoting passages about the Buddha, or from the sutras, or from a single sutra, I might look at a larger topic, one where all 5 of the senses play an important role. In thinking about the 6 lectures that have been given so far, I was struck by 3 particular lacunae, 3 absences. First, there's been much discussion of Indian Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism, and to a lesser extent, Japanese Buddhism, but there's been almost nothing about Tibetan Buddhism. Second, there has been much discussion drawn from Theravada and Mahayana sources, but very little from the Tantras. Third, there's been much discussion about life, but there's been very little discussion of a topic so often associated with Buddhism, death. Each of these is obviously a vast domain, and each has much to say about the senses. One could say, however, that the three, Tibet, Tantra, and death, come together in a single text. The most famous Tibetan Buddhist text that presents a tantric view of death, perhaps the most famous Tibetan Buddhist text on any topic, at least in the European and American world, is, of course, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, published by Walter Evans Wentz in 1927. This work, despite its fame, is fraught with problems. Perhaps the chief of which is Evans Wentz's compulsion to read the text through the lens of theosophy, a school of thought that began in America in the late 19th century as a kind of spiritual response to Darwin, and that became quite influential among European and American intellectuals and artists in the decades that followed. Among its tenets was a system of rebirth that was a kind of spiritual evolution, with beings moving ever upward to higher and higher levels of consciousness as they move from lifetime to lifetime. In his copious prefaces, introductions, and footnotes to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Evans Wentz claimed that this was also the esoteric teaching of the Buddhist doctrine of rebirth, that regression from a god to a ghost or a human to a hell being was impossible. Evans Wentz even claimed that the Tibetan scholar who translated the text for him, Kazidao Samdrup, believed this to be the case. This unlikely claim could not be confirmed because Kazidao Samdrup died before the Tibetan Book of the Dead was published. We are left with the interesting dilemma then that we study the Tibetan Book of the Dead today, both in its first version and in a number of subsequent translations, because of the efforts of Walter Evans Wentz, and yet we must see his book as a willful misreading of the Tibetan text from which his Tibetan Book of the Dead is derived. Kazidao Samdrup translated portions of his Tibetan text called the Bardo Chodrul Chemo, the Great Liberation in the Intermediate State through Hearing. Evans Wentz called it the Tibetan Book of the Dead because it somehow reminded him of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But that is not our topic today. Today, we can say that the Great Liberation in the Intermediate State through Hearing is just one text in a large genre of Tibetan Buddhist works found in all Tibetan sects that deal with the process of death and rebirth, and, as it is said in Tibetan, how to, quote, bring death to the path. The Tibetan title, Liberation in the Intermediate State through Hearing, already suggests this. It also suggests the importance of the senses, in this case, the sense of hearing. Thus, I would like to describe the role of the senses in the process of death and rebirth. The description of this process did not originate in Tibet, but in India, from the Tantric tradition, and especially from the cycle of texts deriving from the Gurya Samadhi Tantra. Here we find a different view of the human body and of sense experience, with the human body not condemned and degraded, but celebrated and exalted as the essential means for the vital transformation into Buddhahood. It is here that we find the process of death described in detail. It is here that we find the description of the intermediate state, the Antarabhava in Sanskrit, the Bardo in Tibetan. And it is here that we find teachings on how to transform death, the intermediate state, and rebirth into the three bodies of the Buddha, the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya. As we will see, the senses play an important role. In order to understand this process, we must first say something about the tantric description of the human body, one that differs in several ways from the descriptions we find in earlier Buddhist texts. According to this tantric physiology, our body is filled with a network of 72,000 nadi, or channels. Through the channels run subtle energies called prana, or winds. This network of channels and winds that flow through them might be understood as a pre-modern version of the autonomic nervous system, because these winds allow for a range of physical functions beyond simple respiration, functions such as locomotion, gustation, digestion, and orgasm. For example, the life-bearing wind resides at the heart and controls respiration, What is called the pervasive wind allows for movement, including opening and closing the eyes. The fire-dwelling wind located at the stomach controls digestion. The upward moving wind allows for speech and swallowing. The downward voiding wind controls urination, defecation, and menstruation. It is said that the winds that course through the channels serve as the mounts of consciousness, carrying the various sense consciousnesses out to their objects and bringing them back to the mind. Thus, we see in this tantric physiology a further articulation of sense experience, with these subtle winds providing transportation for what in the standard Buddhist epistemology are called the indriya, the 5 sense powers. Among the 72,000 channels, the most important is the central channel, the avaduti, which runs from the genitals upward to the crown of the head, then curving down to end in the space between the eyes. Parallel to the central channel are the right channel and the left channel, which wrap around the central channel at several points, creating constrictions that prevent winds from moving freely through the central channel. At these points of constriction, there are also networks of smaller channels that radiate throughout the body. These networks are called wheels, chakra. These are counted as 7, located at the forehead, the crown of the head, the throat, the heart, the navel, the base of the spine, and the tip of the sexual organ. Located in the heart chakra is something called the indestructible drop, said to be the size of a small pea, white on top and red on the bottom. Located inside this drop is the most subtle form of the life-bearing wind, as well as the most subtle form of consciousness, called the mind of clear light. According to the tantric systems, it is the mind of clear light that travels from one lifetime to the next, carried by the life-sustaining wind, yet also impelled by the winds of karma. The mind of clear light is said to become encased inside the indestructible drop at the moment of conception. That drop is formed from the white semen of the father and the red ovum, called blood in Buddhist texts, of the mother, hence its white and red color. The mind of clear light is also the consciousness that achieves Buddhahood. According to the Gelug sect of Tibetan Buddhism, the mind of clear light only becomes fully manifest at the moment of death, making the understanding of the process of death essential for Buddhist practice. The process of death, according to this system, is in fact a process of the winds that course through the body, withdrawing from the extremities and gathering at the top and bottom of the central channel. From there, they descend and ascend through the heart, toward the heart chakra. This takes place in a process called the dissolutions, and it is here that the 5 senses are discussed. Each of the first 4 dissolutions includes an aggregate, form, feeling, discrimination, conditioning factors, an element, earth, water, fire, wind, a sense organ, eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body, and a sense object, form, sound, smell, taste, and object of touch. These dissolve together in sets. For example, in what is called the first dissolution, the first element in each list leads to 4 physical signs and 1 mental sign. Thus, in the first stage of dissolution, we have the dissolution of the form aggregate, the earth element, the eye sense organ, and the forms, that is, the physical elements in one's body. These dissolve, these dissolve together. The outer sign of the dissolution of the form aggregate is that the limbs shrink and one's physical strength diminishes. One's vision becomes blurry and one sees floaters, or in the language of Buddhist text, falling hairs. The outer sign of the dissolution of the earth element is that one's arms and legs become thin and it feels as if one is sinking into the earth. The sign of the dissolution of the eye sense organ is that one can no longer close one's eyes. The sign of the dissolution of forms is that the body loses its pallor. The internal sign or mental sign is that the dying person has a vision of what appears to be a mirage, blue in color, like thick smoke. Next come the dissolutions associated with the aggregate of feeling. Here, the sensations of pleasure and pain derived from sense experience and from thoughts begin to decrease and eventually cease. The sign of the dissolution of the water element is that one's saliva and blood become dry. The sign of the dissolution of the ear sense organ is that one can no longer hear sounds. The external sign of the dissolution of the sounds is that the slight hum that we typically hear during silence ceases. The internal sign or mental sign is that the dying person has a vision of what looks like smoke rising from a chimney in the midst of the thick blue smoke seen before. Next come the dissolutions associated with the aggregate of discrimination. Here, one can no longer remember things about one's family members, even forgetting their names. The sign of the dissolution of the fire element is that one can no longer digest food or drink. The external sign of the dissolution of the nose sense organs that is exhalation becomes long, while inhalation becomes shorter and weaker. The sign of the dissolution of smells is that one can no longer discern pleasant or unpleasant smells. The internal sign of these is called fireflies in the sky, a vision of what appear to be sparks in the midst of the previous puffs of smoke. Next come the dissolutions associated with the aggregative conditioning factors. The external sign of the dissolution of the aggregative conditioning factors is one cannot move one's body. The dying person does not remember anything from the past. The external sign of dissolution of the wind element is exhalation and inhalation cease. Indeed, respiration stops at this point. But from the Buddhist perspective, we are not yet dead. The external sign of dissolution of the tongue sense organ is that the tongue becomes short and thick, and the root of the tongue turns blue. The external sign of dissolution of taste is that one can no longer discern the 6 flavors: sweet, sour, salty, pungent, bitter, and astringent. The sign of the dissolution of the tangible objects in one's body is that one does not discern smoothness and roughness. The internal sign of these is a vision of a flickering flame of a butter lamp when it's about to go out. Next, as the aggregate of consciousness begins to dissolve, all discursive mental activity, all thoughts, referred to in the text as the 80 natural conceptions, cease. Here we see, as we see again and again in Buddhist epistemology, the distinction between sense perception and thought, or conception, vikalpa in Sanskrit. After the senses, which depend on the functioning of the physical sense organs, have ceased, thought remains. The list of 80 conceptions is one of the odder of the many lists in Buddhism. It presumably is meant to be exhaustive, encompassing all forms of thought. It includes emotions like desire, sorrow, fear, compassion, joy, contentment, and heroism. Some of these, like robbery, that is the desire to steal, and donation, that is the desire to give, are emotions that motivate physical deeds. But it's noteworthy that 4 of these foundational mental conceptions involve the mouth and the sense of touch. The 4 are hunger, thirst, the desire to kiss, and the desire to suck, or perhaps better translated as the desire to suckle. From this point on in the process of death, we do not hear about the senses. The senses have shut down. In the Buddhist vocabulary, the winds or energies that empower them have all withdrawn. What remains are various states of mind. This then is yet another example of what we've seen so often throughout these lectures, the subservience of sense to mind. Still, as we shall see, the imagery of sense experience will appear again and again. By the time that the 80 conceptions cease, the winds that have coursed throughout one's body, throughout one's life, have withdrawn from the extremities and gathered at the top and bottom of the central channel. Also by this time, the knots that have constricted the flow of winds into the central channel have begun to loosen, although the knots of the heart chakra, that is, the knots that are located above and below the indestructible drop, remain tight. As the winds begin to descend through the central channel from above, the dying person has a vision of an autumn sky pervaded by white moonlight. As the winds begin to ascend through the central channel from below, the dying person has a vision of an autumn sky pervaded by red sunlight. Now, the knots around the heart begin to loosen, and the winds from above and below pass through them. The dying person seems to swoon, and everything goes black, described as being like a clear autumn night sky pervaded by thick darkness at the moment between sunset and moonrise. Finally, the indestructible drop opens, and the mind of clear light is revealed. The dying person has a vision of a pure autumn sky at dawn, free from moonlight, sunlight, and darkness. This is death. The question is whether the dying person is able to make use of this most precious moment. If one is able to recognize the mind of clear light, Buddhahood can be achieved. If one is not able to recognize the mind of clear light, one will enter the intermediate state, on the way to the next lifetime, yet another embodiment in the beginningless cycle of birth and death called samsara. Given the subject of this lecture series, we will not discuss how death, intermediate state, and rebirth can be transformed into the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya, the three bodies of a Buddha. We will remain in the realm of the senses and will follow the mind of clear light into the bardo and into the next lifetime. However, before doing that, we might pause to consider what this process of death tells us about the Buddhist view of the senses. As we've seen in the previous lectures in this series, sense experience is often devalued in Buddhist texts, often with warnings of its dangers, dangers of deception, and dangers of seduction. As we will recall, we live in the realm of desire, the kama dhatu, where beings are addicted to the pleasures of the five senses, an addiction that only leads to further rebirth in the cycle of suffering. We should therefore not be surprised to see the process of death mirroring elements of the Buddhist path. On the path, one develops insights, both through study and through meditation, that allow one to renounce the pleasures of the senses, severing attachment to this world. In the process of death, that non-attachment, achieved not through the stages of the path, but through the stages of the dissolutions, is involuntary, leaving the dying person who may not have spent a moment in meditation with a vision of reality that is fleeting. And so in the first dissolution, we lose the ability to see clearly, unable to discern the colors and shapes that have so captivated us during our life. Yet we're unable to stop looking because we can no longer close our eyes. As the feeling aggregate dissolves, we are no longer able to derive pleasure from any of our senses, and we lose our sense of hearing. The first two senses, sight and hearing, the most important of the five senses in Buddhism, are the first to go. With the dissolution of the aggregate of discrimination, we can no longer recognize the people we once knew and loved so well, and we can no longer distinguish between good and bad smells. With the dissolution of the aggregate of conditioning factors, we start losing our memory and can no longer distinguish between the six flavors that had delighted our palate for so long, and we cannot tell the difference between rough and smooth. It is a renunciation, an abandonment of sense experience, but it is involuntary. At each step, the dying person has a mental vision, almost an hallucination, and each of these visions is something visual, a mirage, smoke, fireflies, the flickering of a butter lamp, radiant white light, radiant red light, radiant blackness, and clear light. Next, we must enter the bardo. As I've mentioned, the Tibetan word bardo, which literally means between two, is the translation of the Sanskrit antarabhava, intermediate state, or Zhongyou in Chinese. In the third chapter of his Abhidharmakosha, Vasubandhu discusses the intermediate state and the intermediate being in some detail. He begins by noting that some Buddhist schools deny the existence of an intermediate state, asserting that the dying person is reborn into the next lifetime in the moment after death. Vasubandhu rejects this, saying that a grain of rice that is to be planted in a distant village must first be transported there, passing through other villages during the journey. Thus, the being of the intermediate state must travel through time and space to reach its place of rebirth. The bardo is what anthropologists refer to as a liminal state, said to be a time of both opportunity and danger. It serves many purposes in the Buddhist world, both for the dead and for the living. For the dead, it provides a time to find an auspicious rebirth or to escape rebirth entirely. For the living, it provides a time to perform various rituals meant to guide the dead away from hell and into heaven. Because each bardo lasts 7 days and the bardo being may pass through 7 bardos before being reborn, it also provides time for the monastic community to perform a series of rituals over the course of 7 weeks after the death of the departed. Our topic, however, is the senses, so we need to turn to how the senses function in the bardo. The bardo being is called the Gandharva. This is also the name of a type of celestial musician in the Buddhist pantheon, but here it's used for a different purpose, suggested by its literal meaning. The term Gandharva means smell eater. And like the being that it was in its previous life, its previous human life, the life from which it has now departed, it has all 5 senses. But this is one of the only things that it has in common with its fleshly state. Its birth is entirely different. After the mind of clear light departs and the deceased enters the bardo, consciousness passes through the visions of death, but in reverse order: radiant blackness, radiant red light, radiant white light, a flickering butter lamp, fireflies, smoke, and mirage. This is followed by the appearance of the 80 conceptions. But the consciousness that enters the bardo does not enter a womb. It does not grow from childhood to adulthood. It is spontaneously born, fully formed, with a body made not of flesh and blood, but of wind. Although it has all 5 aggregates and all 5 sense faculties, it does not consume solid food. It lives on fragrances. It has a subtle body, not made of flesh and blood, a body whose reflection cannot be seen in water, a body that does not cast a shadow. And it is a body that cannot be destroyed. In addition, it's a body that's able to travel wherever it wishes in an instant. It can pass through things that obstruct humans, through walls and even mountains. Some sources say that it cannot pass through Vulture Peak, where the Buddha taught so many sutras, and that it cannot pass through the Vajrasana, the diamond seat in Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. All sources agree that the only thing that it cannot pass through is its future mother's womb. Vasubandhu states that the being of the intermediate state has all 5 aggregates and assumes the young form of the being it will be reborn as. Thus, if it's going to be reborn as a human, it has the form of a 5 or 6-year-old child. The beings in the intermediate state can see their fellow travelers, but only those who will be reborn in the same realm of rebirth. That is, humans can see humans, gods can see gods, ghosts can see ghosts, and so on. Vasubandhu was writing before the time of the rise of Buddhist Tantra, and thus this suggests that during that period, it was the Buddhist view, or at least the scholastic Buddhist view, that the place of rebirth was karmically determined at the moment of death. It's simply that it took some time. He mentions the figures of both 7 days and 7 weeks in order to arrive there. By the time the tantric view of the intermediate state, best known in the West from the Book of the Dead, but also shared by other Indian and Tibetan texts, by that time, the bardo had become a more liminal state, a state of both danger and opportunity, the danger of being reborn into a lower realm, or from one perspective, the danger of being reborn at all, and the opportunity not only to find a good place for rebirth, but to achieve Buddhahood. The destination was not determined at the moment of death. The bardo is thus often described as a frightening place. Tibetan texts pray for release from what are called the straits of the bardo. There are all manner of visions of peaceful and wrathful deities, all manner of colored lights, all manner of frightening sounds. And so these instructions are to be read aloud to the corpse, and I quote, "O child of Buddha nature, from within these lights, the natural sound of reality will resound, clear and thunderous, reverberating like 1,000 simultaneous peals of thunder. This is the natural sound of your own actual reality. So do not be afraid. Do not be terrified. Do not be awed. The body that you now have is called a mental body. It is the product of subtle propensities and not a solid corporeal body of flesh and blood. Therefore, whatever sounds, lights, or rays may arise, they cannot harm you, for you are beyond death now. It is enough that you simply recognize the sounds and luminosities to be manifestations of your own actual reality. Know that this is the intermediate state. O child of Buddha nature, if you do not now recognize these phenomena to be natural manifestations, whatever meditative practices you may have undertaken whilst in the human world, if you've not previously encountered this present instruction, you will fear the light. You'll be awed by the sound. You'll be terrified by the rays. If you do not understand this essential point of the teaching, you will not recognize the sounds, the lights, and the rays, and you will continue to roam within the cycles of existence. At this time, bewildered and confused by your past habitual tendencies, you'll be frightened by the 5-colored light and wish to turn away. Instantly, you'll be attracted to the dull light of the animal realm. So therefore, do not be frightened now by the bright and flashing 5-colored light. Do not be terrified. Recognize this radiance to be pristine cognition. Within the 5-colored light, all the natural sounds of the sacred teachings will resound like 1,000 simultaneous peals of thunder. They will resound like a violent echo, an overwhelming reverberation, a tumultuous crescendo, a cacophony of war cries, and pound with the roar of wrathful mantras of terrifying ferocity. Do not be afraid. Do not turn away. Recognize these sounds and luminosities to be the naturally expressive power of your own awareness manifesting naturally. When the 5 radiant lights of pristine cognition dawn, may I recognize them as my own nature without awe and without terror. And as the manifold forms of the peaceful and wrathful deities arise, may I fearlessly be confident and recognize the characteristics of the intermediate state. When I experience suffering as a result of negative past actions, may the meditational deities dispel all misery. And as the natural sound of reality reverberates like 1,000 peals of thunder, may all sounds be heard as the resonance of the 6 syllables. End quote. And thus, the sound of 1,000 peals of thunder should be heard as the 6 syllables of the mantra of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, the Bodhisattva whose name in Chinese is Guanshi, perceiver of the sounds of the world. That mantra is Om Mani Padme Hum. At the end of each of the 7 bardos, there are instructions on how to block the womb door. That is, how to prevent yourself from entering one of the 6 places of rebirth. Each gives off its own light, and one is attracted to the light that corresponds to one's karmic destiny. Even here, it's not too late. And many techniques for blocking the womb door are set forth, including visualizing the light as the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, referred to here by another of his many names. He's called Mahakarunika, the Great Compassionate One. But if the womb door cannot be blocked by the end of 49 days, the Bardo being must take rebirth. Here, in a famous anticipation of Freud, it is said that the Bardo being is blown by the winds of karma to the place where its future parents are copulating. Witnessing the primal scene, the Bardo being feels both desire and hatred, desire for the father and hatred for the mother, if it will be reborn as a female, desire for the mother and hatred for the father, if it will be reborn as a male. Imagine itself as taking the place of the hated partner in the sex act. Rushing to the place, it finds itself not embracing the object of its lust, but face to face with only its sex organ. Outraged, the Bardo being is forced by its own karma into the womb from which it cannot escape. It is said that in this moment of hate, it is said that it is this moment of hatred that kills the Bardo being, ending its life in the Bardo and impelling the mind of clear light into the womb of its next mother, where it's now encased in a new instructable drop, white on top from the father's semen, red on the bottom from the mother's blood. And so we see that the 3 poisons, desire for the parent, hatred for the other parent, and the ignorance that has prevented the recognition of reality during the wandering in the Bardo are once again responsible for rebirth. As the fetus develops in the womb, there is the development of namarupa, name and form, the 4th of the 12 links of dependent origination. Name refers to 4 of the 5 aggregates: feeling, discrimination, conditioning factors, and consciousness, while form refers to the form aggregate. Thus, immediately after the moment of conception, the 5 sense consciousnesses are present as what is called name. The 5 sense organs have not yet developed. The fetus initially only has the sense of touch. The next link, sources, refers to the development of these 4 sense organs: sight, hearing, smell, and taste. As these sense organs develop, they encounter the objects of the senses. This leads to contact between the senses and their objects, which leads to attachment, which leads to grasping, which leads eventually to birth, to aging, to death, as the wheel of rebirth turns, with the 5 senses motivating its movement at every stage from lifetime to lifetime. But all is not lost. If at the moment of death, either in life or at the moment of one of the small deaths that take place in the Bardo, we're able to recognize the mind of clear light and are able to use it to understand the nature of reality, we can transform death into the Dharmakaya of a Buddha, transform the intermediate state into the Sambhogakaya of a Buddha, and rebirth into the Nirmanakaya of a Buddha. The goal of the Tantric system, therefore, is to transform death, intermediate state, and rebirth into the 3 bodies of a Buddha. Death is transformed into the Dharmakaya. As we know, the Dharmakaya began as a name for the corpus of the Buddhist qualities, or dharmas, those qualities in which we seek refuge when we say, I go for refuge to the Buddha. But in the Mahayana, and especially in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Dharmakaya might better be described as the ultimate reality in which all Buddhas partake and, in a sense, from which Buddhahood emerges. It's in this sense that Dharmakaya is often translated as truth body. In the commentaries on Maitreyanata's Ornament of Realizations, the Abhismayalankara, the most commented upon of the Indian Mahayana Shastras, we see the Dharmakaya further elaborated as twofold. There is the Swabhavika Dharmakaya, or the nature truth body, and the Jnana Dharmakaya, the wisdom truth body. Here, the nature truth body is reality itself, and the wisdom truth body is the Buddha's omniscient consciousness, constantly in a state of direct realization of that reality. We see here an immediate corollary to the first of the three bardos, the bardo of the moment of death. For it is here that the clear light dawns, that clear light having two aspects, called the mother clear light, which is reality itself, and the child clear light, which is the mind that realizes that reality at the moment of death, or at least that's the goal. Hence, the moment of death is to be transformed into the Dharmakaya in what is called the meeting of mother and child. The intermediate state is to be transformed into the Sambhogakaya, the enjoyment body, that magnificent body of a Buddha that appears to advance bodhisattvas in myriad Buddha fields like Sukhavati, the abode of Amitabha. Just as the bardo being emerges into a new body with magical powers that it previously lacked, now the Dharmakaya manifests in the manifold Buddha fields with a body adorned with the major and minor marks, teaching the Mahayana until the end of samsara. The third of the three bodies is the Nirmanakaya, the emanation body. This is the body that is the transformation of rebirth, where the Buddha enters his mother's womb, a womb carefully chosen by him, exiting from her body 10 lunar months later, with a body endowed like ours, with the five senses that, as we've seen over the course of these lectures, have been enhanced and purified, a body that appears in the world without being powerlessly buffeted by the winds of karma, as we are, but a body that appears in the world to save us from those winds. And perhaps this is the place to conclude this series of lectures on the five senses. But let me consider one last question, and that is this: is there a sixth sense in Buddhism? In English, we use the term sixth sense to refer to a capacity to know beyond that knowledge that can be gained through the five senses. It isn't exactly extrasensory in a supernatural sense, but rather something more akin to intuition. And for good or for ill, since 1999, when a film by that name was released, for many Americans, a sixth sense means I see dead people. In Buddhism, the term that is translated as sense organ or sense power is indriya. And when we go to the Abhidharma, we might be surprised to find that there are not five, but six such powers enumerated. The first five are the five we know so well, the five that have been the subject of this series: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. The sixth sense is the mind, the manendriya, the mental sense organ or the mental sense power, the only one of the sense power that is immaterial. Still, like the other sense organs, it is an essential precondition for knowledge. So what is the mental sense organ? It is simply a previous moment of consciousness, something that seems so obvious as to be banal. But what does it mean? Just as in order for the eye consciousness to see forms, the eye sense organ must function. So in order to think thoughts or to cultivate deep states of concentration, there must be a previous moment of consciousness. It could be any of the five sense consciousnesses, or it could be a previous moment of mind. For one moment of consciousness, there must be a previous moment of consciousness. Without that previous moment, one is dead. Without that previous moment, there can be no birth or death. Without that moment, there can be no rebirth. Without that previous moment, there can be no Buddhahood. And as we've just seen, even death does not stop the production of mind. It is the previous moment of mind producing the next moment of mind, which in turn provides the moment after that, which causes us to cycle in samsara, and that provides the means to escape from the cycle, to use consciousness to bring an end to consciousness in the quiescence of nirvana. Or for those of a more Mahayana bent, to use consciousness to achieve the immeasurable lifespan of a Buddha. Thus, it's because of that sixth sense that we will all one day achieve the state of a Buddha endowed with the divine eye, endowed with the divine ear, whose breath and body are ever fragrant, whose tongue tastes only the flavorful, and whose touch is able to tame the wildest elephant. At least that's what the sutras say. It is the Nirmanakaya of the Buddha, endowed with 5 remarkable senses, that compassionately appears in our world to teach us how to use our 5 senses, to overcome desire for the objects of those senses, that teaches us how to put an end to suffering. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Professor Lopez and Dr. Somorani, for sharing your insights with us today and concluding this lecture series. And thank you everyone for joining us. The lecture videos of this series will be available on our center's YouTube channel, HKU CBS. Please stay tuned and we hope to see you all again soon. Goodbye.